Whatever is born in time develops in three periods. In the first it germinates, is united within itself and lives internally. This is life's root. In the second it drives and pushes, is split and lives externally. This is life's crown. In the third it flourishes, reunites with itself, and matures. This is life's fruit.
On the 21st of January, 1812, a child was born in what had previously been the Jewish ghetto of Bonn, in what was then still part of the Napoleonic French Empire. His French-language birth certificate listed him as Moise Hess, a translation of his Hebrew name Moshe, but for most of his life he would go by the German Moritz. Raised in nearby Cologne at the outset of the Industrial Revolution, Hess was born into a world in which Jewish emancipation was the norm, and Western Jewry had almost entirely abandoned earlier forms of Jewish traditionalism in favor of the Haskalah, Reform, Conservative, and Modern Orthodox Judaism. Nevertheless, Hess received a much more traditional Jewish education from his father and grandfather, both ordained rabbis who made their livings as modest shopkeepers, only for young Moritz to abandon religion entirely at age 16 and become a devotee of the idealist philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Now, Hegel believed and said a lot of things, most of which I can't even begin to understand, and which we thankfully don't need to deal with in this video. But what Hess cared about most was Hegel's philosophy of politics. To massively oversimplify things, Hegel believed that humanity is constantly advancing as it acquires more and more knowledge. In the realm of politics, this human progress was causing states, through a continuous process of either reform or revolution, to gradually settle into an equilibrium whereby governments would perfectly reflect the character and will of the governed. To Hegel, classical liberalism was the final evolution of this state. But towards the end of his life, the more radical faction of his followers, later to be known as the Young Hegelians, argued that liberalism was inadequate, that Hegel's principles didn't merely apply to the power of the state, but also the powers of religion and wealth. Only with Hegel's death in 1831 did the Young Hegelians become aware of each other and begin to exchange ideas. One of the most famous Young Hegelians was Heinrich Heine, a poet and novelist of Jewish birth who had converted to Lutheranism in order to advance his career, but nevertheless continued to identify as a Jew, and remained a leading voice in the emerging Jewish studies movement, as well as a founding member of Young Germany, the German chapter of Giuseppe Mazzini's Young Italy. Just a heads up, Heinrich Heine was basically friends with everybody in this story, and he's the one who introduced Moritz Hess to not just the Young Hegelians, but also another, related movement. Following the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, the great powers of Europe had largely viewed their new political order through a simple dichotomy of strong states versus weak states, and envisioned the consolidation of more strong states as a guarantor of peace. The United Kingdom, by then the world's sole superpower, had gone a step further and viewed Europe through a dichotomy of liberal versus authoritarian states, and thus encouraged liberalization in places like Spain and Italy and the Ottoman Empire. However, this quest for political alignment did nothing to prevent the ever-growing economic disparities between European states, and a growing number of philosophers and politicians became drawn to the idea that the divide between rich and poor, not only between states but within them, was just as critical to European stability as political strength or liberalization, forming the basis of what we know as socialism. At the same time, the mainstreaming of the Haskalah as the primary mode of Jewish practice in Western Europe brought new attention by Jewish thinkers to the works of Spinoza. Moritz Hess was active in all three of these spheres, and when in 1837 his novelist friend Berthold Auerbach published a fictionalized biography of Spinoza, Hess, though only a novice part-time student of philosophy at the University of Bonn, decided to synthesize Hegelianism, socialism, and Spinozism into something approaching a coherent narrative: the Holy History of Mankind. The Holy History separates Hess's conception of Western civilization into three distinct phases. First, he delineates the narrative of the Bible, highlighting the Kingdom of Judea as a society in which spirituality and rational order were one and the same. Then he discusses the rise of Christianity, which he views as having brought about a universalist spiritual message. However, because Christianity didn't provide an accompanying social or legal order, focusing instead on divine reward in the next world, the ensuing power vacuum was filled by systems of inherited private property, inevitably giving rise to feudalism and ultimately corrupting Christianity itself, thus bringing about the Protestant Reformation. In the third part of the Holy History, Hess set apart Spinoza, like Jesus, a man of Jewish birth, as the originator of the emerging secular age, giving way to a deluge of thought culminating in three revolutions: American, French, and industrial. And while these revolutions had succeeded in eradicating the power of the traditional aristocracy of nobility, Hess argued that they created entirely new opportunities for inequality by entrenching what he called an aristocracy of money. In the final portion of the Holy History, Hess outlined his vision of the future, in which the deluge of ideas that had originated with Spinoza would continue to grow in the coming centuries. The abolition of inheritance would slowly wipe away all social inequalities. Men and women would be equal and united in free love, and automation would free everyone to pursue the arts. Keep in mind, The Holy History of Mankind was written by a literal freshman philosophy major. It's not very well written, and its conclusions are dubious. But it does reveal three key concepts that would govern all of Hess's subsequent work. Firstly, The Holy History of Mankind places Jewish history front and center at a time when the Jewish studies movement was only in its infancy. Most of Hess's intended audience would have had a history education similar to most of the people watching this video, in which Jews were rarely mentioned at all, and never as a historical force in their own right. The effect of this was even visible in contemporary politics. Even in the ongoing struggle for Jewish emancipation, Jews themselves rarely took leadership roles, but that was starting to change through figures like David Salomons and Serena Levy-Nathan. And in that spirit, Hess maintained that understanding modern civilization without recognizing the contributions of Jewish civilization was impossible. Hess's second conviction was that the ancient kingdom of Judea, with its complex welfare state and general disinclination towards private property, constituted a primitive example of his envisioned socialist commonwealth. I have some problems with this. Even at its least authoritarian, Judea was still a monarchy, with an oligarchy of rabbis and an entrenched aristocracy of priests and nobles, who attained levels of wealth that few Judeans could ever dream of. But at the same time, that wealth wasn't acquired through the passive ownership of land, and even the lowest social strata enjoyed a number of biblically ordained protections in addition to the aforementioned social safety net. Finally, Hess insisted that a purely material understanding of history, that is, the idea that history is driven entirely by economics, is incomplete. Just as important is an understanding of human spirituality. It's important to note that Hess's definition of spirituality was a lot broader than yours or mine. We today would probably use terms like ideology or identity. To Hess, religion was a kind of spirituality, but so was secularism, and nationalism, and liberalism, and indeed socialism. The Holy History can be a difficult read, but if one thing comes across very clearly, it's Hess's insistence that only a combined understanding of both the material and the spiritual would enable humanity to regain what he called the unity of consciousness that was lost with the destruction of the Judean state and the Jewish temple. Though Hess originally published The Holy History of Mankind anonymously, identifying himself only as a young disciple of Spinoza, its significance as the first socialist literature ever published in Germany brought Hess firmly into the inner circle of a new generation of socialists born after the French Revolution. However, his unapologetic Jewishness and insistence on the interdependence of spirituality and materialism would forever differentiate Hess from his most infamous friend and eventual rival.
The history of all hetero-existing society is the history of class struggle. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressors and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight. A fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes.
Karl Marx was born in 1818 in Trier, where his uncle Samuel Marx had served as chief rabbi and participated in Napoleon's Sanhedrin a decade earlier. Marx's parents were themselves irreligious, but despite having nominally emancipated Jews during the Napoleonic Wars, the Kingdom of Prussia began restricting them from certain professions later in the decade. And around the time Marx was born, his father converted to Lutheranism in order to continue practicing law. This will become important later. A cousin of Heinrich Heine, Marx became involved with the young Hegelians at the University of Berlin, but was denied a PhD there due to his radical theories. He did receive a PhD from the more liberal University of Jena, but turned down a professorship in order to take a job writing for the Rheinische Zeitung, a new left-leaning newspaper based in Cologne and edited by Moses Hess. It was Hess who introduced Marx to the ideas of the French socialists, as well as to his later collaborator Friedrich Engels. But there was always tension between the two men, particularly over their views on Judaism. Neither of them were religious by any means, but Hess remained steadfast in his conviction that Judaism represented a meaningful stage in the development of modern society, that it mattered. Marx did not agree, and more than once referred to Hess derisively as "my communist rabbi." This tension came to a head in 1843, when fellow young Hegelian Bruno Bauer published his book The Jewish Question, the Jewish question having become the common term to describe the ongoing campaign for Jewish emancipation across Europe. Bauer, a militant atheist and sometime conspiracy theorist, argued that full equality in a modern society was incompatible with concepts of identity like religion or nationality. By extension, Bauer concluded that the Jews had no one to blame but themselves for their political alienation. In his response on the Jewish question, Marx argued that political rights are rights. They're unconditional, people are entitled to them by default, making a distinction between political freedom from the state and spiritual freedom from the self. But let's be clear, Marx was in no way defending Judaism or even the Jewish people. Marx believed that all social behavior was the product of economic systems and incentives. He was wrong, and although he, like Bauer, was an atheist, his family's conversion from Judaism to Christianity imbued him with a clear preference for one over the other, which he made very clear in the second half of On the Jewish Question.
Let us not look for the secret of the Jew in his religion, but let us look for the secret of his religion in the real Jew. What is the secular basis of Judaism? Practical need, self-interest. What is the worldly religion of the Jew? Huckstering. What is his worldly god? Money. The Jews have emancipated themselves insofar as the Christians have become Jews. Money is the jealous god of Israel, in face of which no other god may exist.
But the real split between Hess and Marx came with the revolutions of 1848, a wave of liberal and nationalist uprisings that seized almost all of Europe. By this time, the Prussian government had shut down the Rheinische Zeitung, with Hess spending virtually the rest of his life in Paris, while Marx and Engels took up residence in London. Their Communist Manifesto was actually published just as the revolutions of 1848 were beginning to kick off. But their idea of revolution was very different from the ones actually happening around them. Marx and Engels viewed the question of national self-determination as a distraction from socialism. At best, something to be gotten over with in order to resume the real work of proletarian revolution. Hess, however, viewed national liberation as a necessary step towards socialism. For how can the people be free if the state isn't? A perspective that would endear him more and more to the ongoing work of Giuseppe Mazzini in Italy, who not coincidentally had his own falling out with the Marxists, as did Heine, who despaired of his cousin Marx's puritanical sensibilities even as he remained a committed socialist. over the ensuing years, this hybrid ideology of socialism, liberalism, and nationalism would begin to form an identity of its own. Today, we call it social democracy. And to this day, Hess is celebrated in Germany as the first social democrat. This isn't to say that Hess abandoned Marx entirely. Hess noted the growing divide between the Social Democrats and Communists as early as 1847, and was highly critical of it. He remained active in local communist clubs in the vain hope of repairing the rift. And as late as 1869, Hess defended Marx against the criticisms of Mikhail Bakunin and his nascent anarchists. But the revolutions of 1848 had revealed a fundamental and ultimately fatal difference in their worldviews. The successful resurgence of Italian nationalism in the 1850s only strengthened Hess's new direction, and in the years to come, it was nationalism that would most captivate him. In February of 1861, while Italy prepared to finally unite, the new Prussian king Wilhelm I proclaimed an amnesty for all political prisoners and exiles, except for Karl Marx. As far as I can tell, Hess himself had never been formally exiled, only leaving the country out of solidarity with his comrades who had been. But he nevertheless took the opportunity to return and see what had become of his native land and its Jewish community. What he found horrified him. On the 4th of November, 1847, composer Felix Mendelssohn died from a series of strokes. Though only 38 years old, he was already celebrated as one of the finest composers of his era. 3 years later, however, an anonymous pamphlet was published under the title Jewishness in Music, in which Mendelssohn and fellow composer Giacomo Meyerbeer were not only excoriated for their supposed artistic conservatism, but blamed for holding back German art and the German nation as a whole due to their Jewish ancestry. 19 years later, the author of Jewishness in Music revealed himself as not only a fellow composer, but Meyerbeer's own protege, Richard Wagner.
We must explain to ourselves the involuntary repellence possessed for us by the nature and personality of the Jews, so as to vindicate that instinctive dislike which we plainly recognize as stronger and more overpowering than our conscious zeal to rid ourselves thereof. Without once looking back, take ye your part in this regenerative work of deliverance through the bloody struggle of self-annihilation. Then are we one and undissevered. But bethink ye that only one thing can redeem you from your curse, the redemption of Achashverosh, going under.
Wagner's call for Jews to assimilate through baptism casually sidestepped the fact that the late Mendelssohn was baptized. He had been a Christian since childhood. And sure enough, Wagner found himself at the center of a century-long shift in the nature of anti-Jewish prejudice that had begun with François de Hell in the 1770s and quickly found its home in Germany alongside the emerging sciences of heredity and genetics, and accompanying pseudosciences of racialism and eugenics. During Hess's return to Germany, the historian and far-right nationalist Heinrich von Treitschke embraced social Darwinism as an explanation of Germany's special destiny as Aryans to overpower and exterminate so-called weak races, such as Africans, Poles, Lithuanians, and Jews. He specifically singled out Jews as an impure racial element whose usefulness had run out and thus required eradication. Up to this point, prejudice against Jews in Germany was simply known as Jew hate, but following Germany's eventual unification, journalist Wilhelm Marr would take great efforts to coin a new, friendlier-sounding term based in the supposed science of racial eugenics: anti-Semitism. Now, it's often assumed that the German nationalism of this era was broadly anti-Semitic, and that Germany's unification had a generally negative impact on German Jews, but that isn't true at all. The Frankfurt Parliament, which had attempted to unify Germany during the revolutions of 1848, included 5 Jewish members, including its vice president, Gabriel Riese. Robert Blum, the leftist leader who had helped create the parliament, had been an outspoken critic of German ethnocentrism and anti-Semitism. The revolutions of 1848 more broadly are often called the Springtime of Nations, a term that was coined by a Jewish-born German author, Ludwig Börne. And Prussian Prime Minister Otto von Bismarck, who had opposed Jewish emancipation as a young man, later championed Jewish emancipation across Germany and beyond, and ferociously condemned anti-Semites like Treitschke, who were only ever a small minority. But unlike in every other country, that vocal minority was always part of the conversation. It never went away, it never stopped, and as such, the Jewish question, as Bauer called it, was never resolved. In revolutionary France and reformist Britain, the Jewish question had long since been answered. Jews were citizens. In nationalist Italy, there had never been a Jewish question to begin with, as Jewish emancipation was intrinsic to the nationalist cause. But German nationalism had allowed reactionary and authoritarian elements to survive where others had not. Germany hadn't yet unified in 1861, but it was already clear that unification was coming, and it would not silence the anti-Semites. Around this same time, Hess went to work as a French translator for Heinrich Graetz, a history teacher at the Rabbinic Seminary of Breslau, then in the midst of a 22-year project to document the entire history of the Jewish people, from the First Temple period to the revolutions of 1848. Graetz's presentation of Jewish history has basically served as the model for how it's been taught ever since, particularly in primary schools and Western synagogues. But this presentation also deeply troubled Hess. Despite Graetz's intentions of providing a positive, uplifting history, Hess found within it a vicious cycle, in which the Jews of Europe would be tolerated for a time, only to be persecuted and humiliated, and, instead of fighting back, seek solace in the vagaries of religion. Even now, Breslau's outgoing chief rabbi, Abraham Geiger, continued to insist that assimilation and an aesthetically westernized form of Jewish practice would disprove or even appease the anti-Semites, which clearly wasn't happening. To all of this, Hess responded, "It doesn't have to be this way." It wasn't always this way.
After an estrangement of 20 years, I am back with my people. A thought which I believed to be forever buried in my heart has been revived in me anew. It is the thought of my nationality, which is inseparably connected with the ancestral heritage and the memories of the Holy Land, as well as the hope in the future brotherhood of men.
In 1862, Moritz Hess began identifying once more by his birth name, Moses. For the first time since childhood, he celebrated Jewish holidays, ate Jewish food, spoke Hebrew, and found comfort at the Jewish cemetery of Deutz, where his parents were now buried. This was not born of a faith in God, for he was no more a believer now than he had been when he first discovered the writings of Spinoza. Rather, he had rediscovered his faith in his people. Spinoza had observed, and Graetz had all but illustrated, that Judaism as a tradition is rooted in cycles, not of persecution and religion, but of agriculture, of harvests and cultivation, specific to the climate and geography of a state whose constitution and laws, once deprived of that state and removed from its native habitat, had become a religious abstraction which had served the Jewish people as both a fortress and a prison. Hess knew this. He had, after all, first envisioned Judea as the original socialist commonwealth, and in this, he found an answer to the fundamental challenge facing Germany's Jews. In the midst of this journey of rediscovery, Hess compiled his observations in Rome and Jerusalem, a study in Jewish nationalism. The book begins with an extensive recap of the previous 3 centuries of Jewish history, basically everything I've been making videos about for the past year. He praised those who refused to compromise, who instead embraced Judaism and modernity together. The Ramchal, the revival of the Hebrew language, the worldly Hasidism of Chabad, the French consistory model, in which all modes of Jewish thought were united in a single pluralistic system, and the emerging American way of Judaism, where strict observance was largely abandoned, but Jewishness as a whole was flaunted. By contrast, Hess argued that German Jewry was fundamentally doomed. Germany was a place where men like Abraham Geiger took every distinct tradition and joy out of Judaism in the hopes of appeasing men like Treitschke who would never accept them.
Even conversion itself does not relieve the Jew from the enormous pressure of German Jew hate. The German hates the Jewish religion less than the race. He objects less to the Jews' peculiar beliefs than to their peculiar noses. Neither reform nor conversion nor emancipation throw open to the Jew the gates of social life. Jewish noses cannot be reformed, and the black wavy hair of the Jew will not change through conversion into blonde, nor can its curves be straightened out by constant combing. It did not help Meyerbeer that he was always careful not to include Jewish themes in his operas. Whenever mentioning his name, the respectable Augsburger Allgemeine adds parenthetically, actually Meyer Lippmann-Beer. It did not help the German patriot Börner that he Christianized his original name Baruch. He himself admits it, saying that whenever my opponents are at a loss for argument against Börner, they always bring up Baruch.
Furthermore, in Hesse's eyes, the danger faced by Jews in Germany constituted a threat to the entire Jewish world. Even in liberal democratic societies like Italy, where Jews had been socially accepted and legally emancipated, they were everywhere a minority, forever subject to the whims of the majority. And times can change. Therefore, the only way to ensure that Jews remained free and equal as citizens of states was if they became free and equal as a state. As Judea was once the original socialist commonwealth, so it shall be again.
With the Jews, more than with other nations, which, though oppressed, live on their own soil, all political and social progress must necessarily be preceded by national independence. A common native soil is a primary condition if there is to be more progressive relations between capital and labor.
Of course, Hess had no idea how an independent, social democratic Jewish state in what was then the Ottoman Empire would come to be, but he believed it was historically inevitable, and offered his prediction for what would make it so. Hess wrote Rome and Jerusalem during the American Civil War, a conflict which, in the eyes of many leading European socialists, portended a worldwide decline of what Hess called race rule. However, while Hess predicted that most of Western Europe in the coming decades would steadily give up concepts of race rule, Germany would be utterly consumed by it, and in the process declare war on the entire world.
The age of race dominance is at an end. Like the patriots of other unfortunate nations, the German patriots can attain their aim only by means of a friendly alliance with the progressive and powerful nations of the world. But if they continue to conjure themselves, as well as the German people, with the might and glory of the German sword, they will only add to the old unpardonable mistakes, grave new ones. They will only play into the hands of reaction and drag all Germany along with them.
Hess remained confident that any such conflict would result in a German defeat, and that the Western powers would rebuild Germany as a modern social democratic state, but at enormous cost. Not least that such a war would be the end of European Jews. Nevertheless, in the event of such a conflict, the ailing Ottoman Empire would surely collapse, and the Jewish people would unite, hand in hand with their Arab neighbors, as they took their rightful place among the Brotherhood of Nations.
No Jew, whether Orthodox or not, can conscientiously refrain from cooperating with the rest for the elevation of the entire Jewry. Every Jew, even the converted, should cling to the cause and labor for the regeneration of Israel.
For the rest of his life, Hess committed himself to the dream of an agrarian socialist commonwealth of Jews and Arabs in Palestine. In 1865, he joined Adolphe Crémieux and the Alliance Israélite Universelle in establishing the agricultural school of Mikveh Yisrael, just outside Jaffa. But Rome and Jerusalem was met with scorn and mockery at worst, and indifference at best. He died in Paris in 1875, and his body was returned to the newly born German Empire to be buried with his family in Cologne. There was one thing he was right about, though. Throughout all of this, Jews were leaving Germany. They were leaving in the tens of thousands. But they weren't heading east towards Jerusalem. They were going west. way west. Further west than any Jewish community had gone before. Special thanks to my patrons, including Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskind, Boris Cherny, FC, Jay Fleischman, Oshar Gordon, Serhii Herasimov, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, and Eric Liederman.